Namaskaram to everyone. Also, warm welcome to those who are join this journey of wisdom, join the Wisdom Parivar on the sacred study of the text Atmabodha. Atmabodha, Atma means the self, Bodha means the knowledge. So the term Atmabodha literally means the knowledge of the self. A text which consists of 68 verses. A quick overview as to what's expected of the text. The text is actually summarized into 8 topics. The first 5 topics, it talks that the knowledge of the self alone liberates man. Verses 1 to 5. Verses 6 to 15. It talks about the material upadhis, the material equipments which superimpose the world on Brahman. Verses 6 to 15, I repeat, the knowledge of the self alone liberates man, verses 1 to 5. Verses 6 to 15, the material equipments which are known as upadhis superimpose the world on Brahman. Verses 16 to 29 rather. 16 to 29, he talks about by a discriminative self-analysis, you separate the self from the material equipments. You need the viveka to separate the self from the material equipments. So by discriminative self-analysis, you separate the self from the material equipments. That's from verses 16 to 29. The fourth topic, 30 to 40, through the process of negation and assertion and meditation, you realize the self. So the process of negation, assertion, and meditation, you realize the self, verses 30 to 40. The fifth topic, the knowledge destroys ignorance. The self reveals itself, verses 41 to 46. And the sixth topic, the self-realized merges with Brahman, 47 to 53. 54 to 64. The nature of Brahman. And the last topic, 65 to 68, talks about how the knowledge of the self reveals Brahman. The knowledge of the self reveals Brahman. So indeed, it's going to be an extraordinary journey into the text Atmabodha. The Guru doesn't need any introduction, the great Adi Shankaracharya. In fact, this text is a prakriya grantha, is a text which is used as an introductory textbook to the deeper studies of the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads. So Bhaja Govindam is an introductory textbook. Atmabodha is a little advanced than the Bhaja Govindam, and it comes in between the Bhaja Govindam and the Gita. So Atmabodha, as known as a prakarana, these are expository and dialectical works in prose and poetry, which enunciate and elucidate certain terms and expressions which are used in the scriptures. So these are prakaranas, they are expository and dialectical works which explain certain terms which are explained in the Shastras, in the scriptures. So I'm afraid you will find that you will be challenged in understanding the concepts, and if you have a certain fundamentals of the concepts we have discussed and dealt before, you will be able to understand the deeper message conveyed. But however, don't worry, and I can assure you, I'll be there right throughout to help you wherever you find difficulty to sail through these intricate, subtle, philosophical concepts. But do make it a point that you take a note of these concepts so it helps you understand, and also you have the material you can fall back on. All right. This is a very traditional text, which a very unique flavor. In fact, you will have an insight into the orthodox texts, how they are packaged and how they convey the message. Now, the unique flavor of this text, Atmabodha, is throughout the text, he uses a very specific methodology to communicate. As you should be aware, because we have mentioned it, for those of you who have not heard of it, the knowledge of the self can be communicated through 4 means. There are 4 methodologies how a guru communicates this knowledge, or you can actually gain this knowledge, not just guru conveying, also a way you can gain this knowledge. The one way of gaining this knowledge is through pratyaksha. The first means of acquiring knowledge is through pratyaksha, is known as direct perception, where you have got the experience by yourself, where you have gained a certain knowledge and understanding, where you say, I have seen that roof collapse right in front of me. It's direct. I've seen it myself. Oh, it was such a close. It could have been a terrible accident. I just missed it by a few inches. It just fell right in front of me. Pratyaksha. It's not a heard say. It's not indirect. It's direct perception. Pratyaksha. So you can gain knowledge of the self through pratyaksha. Second, you can gain knowledge of the self through what is known as anumana, which is inference. You infer. You don't see the self, but you infer it indirectly. Like we say, you see smoke from a distance, you infer there is something burning out there, there's fire. But you don't see fire, you only see smoke. Similarly, there are certain attributes of a man of realization or a spiritually evolved person, and you can infer the self, you can infer the wisdom through those inferences. You don't see the indirect ways of acquiring knowledge. Third is through upamana. Upamana is through comparison. Comparison is through giving various examples, anecdotes, parables, or similes. And this is the methodology which Adi Shankaracharya uses in the text Atmabodha. Literally every verse you'll find there is an example to convey. But I must tell you, whenever you use an example or a methodology or a simile or a metaphor, there is a limitation in an example or a story or a comparison. So there are only certain aspects of comparison. The moment you go beyond the purview of the example actually becomes absurd and redundant. So keep that in mind, that don't stretch the example beyond its purpose of conveying a certain message, a certain aspect of comparison. Now you'll see throughout the text. So once we get into it, there will be more than one chance for me to clarify where should you not get into. And the fourth and the last means of conveying this knowledge is through agama, which is through tradition. Agama is the tradition of the guru, shishya, parampara, the preceptor, disciple lineage. So you can gain knowledge of the self through either pratyaksha or through anumana, or through upamana, or through agama. Now the text approaches the principle of upamana, which is comparison. Now, as the text titles knowledge of the self, the knowledge of the self, the only objective of this knowledge is to address or combat spiritual ignorance. There is no other objective. Just like you switch on the light to dispel the darkness, just as light dispels darkness, here is the knowledge that dispels ignorance. Whichever way you adopt, whichever methodology you approach the text or you draw knowledge from, the objective is to address the ignorance. Now, the ignorance manifests in three forms. The three levels of ignorance are lack of information. Second is lack of understanding. The third is lack of experience. Ignorance expresses in three forms: lack of information, lack of understanding, lack of experience. Now, lack of information is addressed through the process of lending thy ears. You listen to great masters, you either read a text or a scripture or literature where you combat the first level of ignorance. I did not know. I do not know what the truth is. I do not know what the self is. I haven't even heard that there's something called the text Atmabodha. You do not know. And then you can get rid of the first level of ignorance is by Shravana, listening. It's called Shravana because those days there was no scriptural literature in writing. It was all through verbal. So you lend your ears to someone and you learn. That addresses the first level. But remember, that's just the first level of ignorance. Now, today we are in an era where you're inundated with information. The problem is you have too much information. If somebody comes and says, I do not know, I congratulate him. Glad you do not know. If any one of you say, sir, I do not know this, pat your back. Oh my God. Not knowing is the best state to be in now. Because there's so much of undoing that has to happen. So much of unlearning has to happen. Because too much knowledge is no good. Now, knowledge is good, but if you have not allowed the process to metamorphose, so the knowledge, when it metamorphoses, when it goes through the process of crystallization, when the knowledge gets digested and crystallized, it expresses as wisdom. But the amount of knowledge we have, without allowing it to go through the process of metamorphosis or without the process of settling the knowledge remains as information and it doesn't serve the purpose. In fact, the very same knowledge becomes a curse than a blessing. So bear that in mind. And the only way to address that gap between knowing and not living, that gap, I'm sure all of you would agree that, yes, sir, I seem to know a lot more, but I don't seem to live by all what I know. Isn't it? I'm sure you all agree to it. I wish I can live all the values which I'm able to very liberally advocate others. I'm inspired by it though, but I'm not able to fully allow it to trickle into my life, change my perceptions, change my life. There's a disparity. Now that is addressed by the second level of ignorance, which is lack of understanding. The lack of understanding is addressed through the most essential spiritual study, which is known as reflection or manana. We have dealt with it before. Manana is a conscious spiritual exercise where you consciously revisit the ideas that you have heard with the only objective of instilling, reinvigorating, reinforcing those ideas so that that very thought or idea translates into action. So the process of reflection, what it does is it reinforces a thought which you have planted. And when you have done sufficient manana, there comes a time where your mind is matured, where you actually have the experience of the self through the process of nididhyasana, which is meditation. That's the last obstacle, the last stage of ignorance is overcome. through the process of meditation, where you gain the experience of the self. So there are 4 means of approaching this knowledge to combat the 3 means of ignorance. So we are pampered with choice. Make the most of what's coming your way.